From my experience, it's easier to grow tomatoes than most people realize. You can save a lot of money by starting from a seed packet instead of a baby plant that you buy from a nursery or some local store. So with that said, in this video, I'm going to walk you through my foolproof method for seed starting tomatoes from seed at home and getting them through their first month of growth. Depending on your growing location and the time of year that you're watching this, it is entirely possible to start from seed and have a substantial plant at 1 month. A plant that has developed enough to be able to plant it in the ground, in the outside garden. The majority of seeds that you start aren't going to go into the garden until around month 2, but 1 month is not out of the realm of expectations. In fact, I'm putting a 1-month-old, a 30-day-old plant in the garden this weekend. And the trick for success in all of this is not actually a trick at all. It's simply do all of the things, take all of the steps, take all of the actions. And if you do it all, it's pretty hard to fail. Now, depending on the size of the plant, you could go off to the store and buy plant starts, little baby plants. Depending on the size, anywhere between $3 to $10 each. At that price range, you're looking at somewhere between $18 and $60 for a small 6-pack of plants. Even then, you're still going to have to invest some time and money into the care of those baby plants before you actually get them into the garden, usually. Conversely, for the price of a $5 seed packet, you can get somewhere between 10 to 30 seeds per packet for about $5. And depending on how fast you use those seeds, how many plants you grow, that seed packet could last you anywhere from 1 to 5 seasons. And because a good rule of thumb to follow is a single plant could easily produce you 20 pounds of tomatoes, then 6 seeds could turn into 6 plants, giving you 120 pounds of tomatoes over the course of 1 single growing season. For a $5 seed packet, that is an extreme bargain. So let's start with a plan. And the first step in that plan is to identify the right time of year to actually start your seed. In the segment that follows, I go into everything that you need to know about when to start your seed. Tomatoes will die if the temperature drops below the frost line. This is especially true for young tomato plants in early spring. At the same time, tomatoes do their best before the peak heat of summer, so you don't want to wait too long either. If you wait too long, then you might get more leaf and shoot growth than you want compared to flowering and fruit development. The longest days of the year stretch from late March through early September, peaking in June. So obviously you want your tomatoes in the ground before June if possible, but not at the risk of a late spring frost. I used to live at elevation in eastern Oregon, and we rarely put tomatoes in the garden beds until mid-June. Typically indoors, a tomato seed will germinate in about 7 days. After that, it's going to take about 14 more days for the first true leaves to significantly take over for the cotyledons. But even then, the first set or 2 of true leaves won't really be big enough to fully repot and bury until at least another 4 weeks passes. That right there is a full 7 weeks, just shy of 2 months. Let me pause and put a caveat in here. This plant right here, this is 30 days from when I put the seed in soil. I featured this plant throughout this mega video. Ideally, 2 months, this plant is going to be way bigger. It's going to have much more substantial roots. But if it's already later in the season, or if you have very mild spring weather and you really want to push it, this plant right here could very easily go into the ground at 1 month, 30 days. Follow all the steps in this video, you'll have a plant just like that. Let's just say that at week 6, after seeding tomatoes into an amended seed starting mix, you could replant the tomatoes into a larger container, burying that main stem as much as possible. You would then wait another 3 to 4 weeks after that, taking you to week 9 or 10, for enough leaves and shoot growth to develop to the point where the entire plant could be transplanted into a garden bed for the remainder of the season. If you didn't want to do the repot, then instead of waiting all the way until week 10, you could dial it back to around week 7, but your plant root system would be significantly smaller. We'd only do all of this, though, if your outside conditions were past the risk of frost or freeze. For places that tend to get a last freeze around the 1st of April, then around the 1st of February is a good place to start indoor tomatoes from seed. However, that is the earliest time possible, and it's not exactly what I recommend. If your last frost date is April 1st, then that's still 2.5 months away from the summer solstice. The days are not long quite yet, and average temperatures are not something that I recommend betting against. Some years, a last frost might happen on March 20th, while other years that last frost might happen closer to April 15th. It's called an average for a reason. It's always best to plan on being cautious with tomatoes, especially when they can catch up so fast in those 14 to 15-hour days of late June. Although tomatoes can easily start dropping their flowers in high heat, commonly found in July, they don't grow vigorously in the low temperatures of March and April, so keeping them indoors during that time of year, even if you don't expect a frost, it doesn't usually set you back very much. I recommend counting back from your average last frost date 4 weeks to start plants indoors, only for those areas of the country with early last frost dates, getting them outside later in the season. If your last frost is on March 1st, then start the plants indoors around February 1st, planning to get them outside in early April, way past your expected last frost date. This is because you don't want them to have to go outside when the days are still short and the risk for a late frost are still there. Now, on the other hand, if you have an average last frost date that is late in the season, let's say early June, then I recommend starting your seeds indoors closer to 7 to 8 weeks out so that they have more time to mature indoors before heading outside. And if your local weather is on the cooler side of the spectrum in late spring, a 6-week-old plant can easily stay in a smaller pot indoors for a bit longer while you wait for the weather to warm up for good. A June 1st last frost date would then translate into an indoor seeding date of around April 10. That effectively means most people will seed their tomatoes indoors between February 1st and April 10th, regardless of where they live. By mid-June, the days are extremely long, so plants going into the ground at that time of year are going to have a ton of sun available to them, allowing them to quickly catch up and start producing flowers and fruit just fine. Even in the mountains of Oregon, my wife and I were able to harvest tons of tomatoes every summer, even when we waited until June 15th to transplant outside. In general, frosts will kill tomato plants, but cool 45-degree mornings can also slow them down quite a bit. Southern locations can get better plants by waiting longer into the season to seed tomatoes indoors, 4 weeks past last frost, while cooler locations up north or at elevation should start their seeds roughly 8 weeks prior to the last frost, expecting the long days of June and July to catch their plants up. In all situations, though, starting seeds indoors requires a full sun window at least, if not basic grow light setup to keep the plants from getting too leggy and weak while still indoors. Transplanting deeply can help those leggy plants recover, but avoiding this problem is best practice. I don't think everyone needs to have a fancy and expensive grow light setup in their garage, but at bare minimum, you should have access to at least a single grow light bulb that can be placed into a clamp-on lamp that can be directed at the plants or at a tray of plants. This basic setup of mine was put together for only about $30, $10 for the lamp and $20 for the bulb. It works just great and keeps those young tomato plants going while they wait for spring weather to really warm up. Obviously, if you've got tons of plants, then you're going to have to upgrade your system. But for small-scale gardening, your grow light setup in the garage doesn't have to be big or fancy. Links to these basic items are in the description below, but I'm sure you can easily find this stuff locally at your nearest big box store. Remember, one single plant can give you way more tomatoes than most people realize, and it can be a largely hands-off project if you want it to be. Okay, so based on all of that, you're most likely going to be starting your seeds somewhere between February 1st and April 10th, regardless of where you live. But that doesn't mean that that's when I advise starting the process. The process starts about a month before, maybe not quite a full month before, but beforehand, you have to start priming your potting soil. I start my soil weeks before I ever put my first seed in the dirt. You see, all plants that grow from seed get their first couple weeks of nutrition from the seed itself. The nutrients that are in the seed will keep that baby plant healthy for about 2 to 3 weeks, regardless of what they're growing in. In dicot plants, like tomatoes, the cotyledon leaves, or the seed leaves, not only provide the nutrition that the plant needs, but they also start photosynthesizing, giving the plant energy to grow, put on roots, and eventually develop their first and second set of true leaves. Because of all of this, the seed starting medium is usually devoid of all nutrients and is completely sterile, or at least as close to it. That basicness of the seed starting medium is what helps most baby plants develop without developing disease. You could actually start these seeds in pretty much anything. Pure sand works, unamended peat moss, or even plain straw. Plant in any of these things and the plant will do just fine, until the plant started needing extra nutrition, of course. Now, seed starting mixes are typically very light, very airy, very simple, and pretty inexpensive. And you don't need very much of them either because seed starting containers are very small. It's only when the plants get big enough, after 2 to 3 weeks, that's when we transplant them into potting soil, into slightly larger containers. But organic potting soil tends to have nutrients in it in small loads that aren't quite plant available yet. So before I actually plant my seed or sow my seed, I make sure that the potting soil that I'm going to be using is ready for that transplant. The soil needs to be ready to release the nutrients into the plant when it needs it most. In the following segment, I explain my entire process for preparing my potting soil, preparing my transplant soil for the baby plants. This is done weeks before seed goes into the dirt, and it's what I call priming the soil. Tomatoes grow their best and fruit the most when they're well fertilized. But unfortunately, most people who grow them don't get the most out of the fertilizers that they use. Organic fertilizers are almost always unavailable to plants for at least a month, if not 2, after application. So if you happen to drop eggshells or crushed oyster, bone meal, fish emulsion, or anything else into your planting hole, almost none of the fertilizers will be used by the tomatoes until those plants are well established. Ideally, young plants will have access to plant-available nutrients during the sprout and pout phase. You want the plants to be able to access the fertilizers as early in the growth cycle as possible without having to use any synthetics. The trick to getting the most out of your fertilizers is to literally start amending your planting soil as early as possible, ideally weeks before you start your seeds or get your starts into the ground. Generally speaking, tomatoes need roughly twice as much phosphorus and potassium as they do nitrogen over the course of a full growing season. So what I like to do is dose out in a bowl what my plants are going to need from roughly weeks 3 through 8. Because all seeds naturally come pre-packed to get the plant growing for the first couple weeks, I time my fertilizer priming to end around day 14 or so. For my tomatoes, I like to mix together bone meal, alfalfa meal, and langbeinite for my NPK inputs. Then I mix in a bit of mycorrhiza, worm castings, and humic acid just to juice the fertilizers even more. That stimulates a ton of biological activity. Hit that like button, folks. Let's continue on. With my amendments dosed out, I then add them to a sizable portion of peat moss, and then I mix it all up with water. I don't plant into it though. I just cover the mixture loosely and then let it sit largely untouched for a few weeks to a month before using it. The time spent in waiting is where the bacteria living in the soil mixture starts breaking down the fertilizers, making them plant available. We do this in advance so that the plants can actually use them while establishing roots and growing in size. With a loose lid, things shouldn't dry out too much while you wait. If it does start to dry, then just add a touch of water and give it another stir to keep it all damp. Eventually, you'll take your plants to their final growing location, your planting hole, or you'll pot them up from their seed starting mixture. At that time, you can add some of your primed fertilizer mixture to each planting hole or each pot, and most of the fertilizers in the mixture should be ready for the plants to uptake and use pretty much right away. If you do this fertilizer priming technique, I promise you'll see healthier tomato plants and you'll get way more fruit than you've ever gotten before. And remember, extra information can be found in the video description below. Okay, but what about the fertilizer that's actually used to prime the soil or used for that final transplant into the garden? How much do you put in? What options do you have? Can you just use off-the-shelf, store-bought fertilizer? To more deeply answer these questions and others, and to better guide you on the plant's nutritional needs throughout the plant's life cycle, I got something for you. Don't worry though, the actual seed starting segment is coming up soon. But first, this segment is all about blending your own fertilizer to fine-tune the applications that you make to your plants throughout the growing season. You need to have your fertilizer on hand before you sow your seeds if you want that fertilizer to be plant available once the plant is a couple weeks old. It's easy to grow tomato plants from seed or starts, but if you actually want to harvest tons of tomatoes from those plants, then you have to fertilize those plants well. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 different fertilizing options to choose from, ranging from best and hardest to follow to pretty good and quite easy to follow. That doesn't mean you give them huge nutrient loads. It means you give them the right mixture of nutrients at the right time of the growth cycle. I hope you'll consider all 3 options before deciding which is right for you. For simplicity's sake, you can always buy the off-the-shelf tomato fertilizers, like this one, Tomato Tongue. But depending on how many tomato plants you have and what other plants you're growing in the garden, it can be cheaper and better for your plants to mix the ingredients in the fertilizer yourself. In my garage, I always have langbeinite on hand for my plants' potassium needs. I've got alfalfa meal on hand for all of the rich organic matter preloaded with tricontinol that stimulates root development, and the OMRI-listed slow-release nitrogen and potassium. I also keep bone meal on hand for any plants that might need extra phosphorus. I regularly stock gypsum for pH-neutral calcium, meaning it's not going to change the pH of the soil up or down. And I always keep on hand a number of biostimulants and additives like humic acid, worm castings, mycorrhiza, kelp, green sand, all of which I use to some extent on my tomatoes. As you likely already know, tomato plants do best when we start them, then bury the starts deep when we pot up. Then bury them deep again when we finally plant them into their ultimate planting location. That means my optimal fertilization practice is broken into 3 parts. I fertilize my plants at each step in the growing cycle. And for the longer growing seasons, those tomato plants that are still growing and producing during months 5, 6, and 7, I'll add a 4th top dressing of fertilizer around month 4. Make sure to hit that like button, guys. I'm hoping this video is going to help you out a lot. Now, let's continue on. There are lots of differing opinions on NPK requirements of tomatoes, but it's widely understood that tomatoes should have more phosphorus and potassium than nitrogen over their life cycle to produce tomatoes instead of just leaves. So we have to be aware of the nutrient density of our inputs by weight when dosing them out. Generally, tomatoes need more nitrogen and phosphorus in the beginning, and then increasing amounts of phosphorus and potassium compared to nitrogen as the plant matures. I don't believe in guessing. I believe in measuring and applying precise amounts of inputs. It all but guarantees the perfect harvest, so long as irrigation is delivered regularly and in the right amounts. For a standard 4-month tomato plant growing season, for each individual plant, I shoot for 3/4 of an ounce of bone meal, 1 1/3 ounces of alfalfa meal, and 0.3 ounces of langbeinite, plus roughly a tablespoon of humic acid, worm castings, plus a dash of granular mycorrhiza at time of seeding. Then, at time of first potting up and trunk burying, I add another ounce of bone meal, 2 ounces of alfalfa meal, and 1/2 ounce of langbeinite. Finally, at time of final transplant, and the second trunk burying, I add another 2 ounces of bone meal, 4 ounces of alfalfa meal, and 1 full ounce of langbeinite. This is also when I start adding fermented rice water to my irrigation roughly every week. This provides plant-available calcium, magnesium, and potassium to the soil right as the plant is focusing its main energy on flowering, fruiting, and ripening. If you've done a soil test and you know you already have plenty of calcium and magnesium in your soil, then this isn't nearly as important. Also, you could just amend your final planting hole with a bit of gypsum before planting the tomatoes to get calcium into the soil without altering the soil pH. This would also minimize the need for using rice water during the latter stages of the plant's life cycle. Gypsum and lime, these are very easy things to add to the soils at time of planting, but they tend to become plant available very slowly, sometimes slower than a full growing season. That's why I think the rice water addition is so helpful, even if you do add calcium to your planting hole. I have a whole video about the rice water addition. It's linked in the video description if you'd like to learn more about that technique. Now, if you do live in a location where your tomato plant is likely to keep producing during months 5, 6, and 7, then somewhere around month 4, I'll add another dose of bone meal, alfalfa meal, and langbeinite to the top of the soil profile, that kind of upper inch or so. That's going to continue pushing healthy plant function into the late stages of the plant's growth cycle. For colder climates, this isn't usually necessary. For instance, plants in a garden growing from months May through October, they may not need this extra nutrient load, but plants growing in the garden from April through November, they probably would benefit from that extra application at month 4. For in-ground locations, that's going to be planted year after year, then it helps to amend the planting bed with some green sand or azomite. These inputs add enormous quantities of trace minerals to the soil. You don't need to add very much of the stuff, though, because a little goes a long way. There's like 60, 70 trace elements that could go into the soil. You're going to get basically some of all of that if you add azomite to the planting hole. Your plants are unlikely to benefit from these additions in that first season, but over the years, future crops will benefit from this type of gradual soil building. If you wanted to be more simple with your application of fertilizer, then you could just mix all these applications together into one single fertilizer application at the start. Every tomato plant would get roughly 3 3/4 ounces of bone meal, 7 1/3 ounces of alfalfa meal, and 1 3/4 ounces of langbonite, along with a bit of the previously mentioned biostimulants and possibly gypsum. And to simplify the process even more, you could buy a pre-mixed product like tomato tone or something else. This particular product has an equivalent NPK ratio of 1.5 to 2, which is pretty close to my desired ratio of 1 to 2. Tomato tone uses a lot of the same inputs I mix together myself, including calcium and green sand, but in my opinion, it's much more expensive than mixing the ingredients yourself, and you have a lot less flexibility in how the fertilizer is used. An 18-pound bag of tomato tone could run you around $30 and yield you roughly 36 cups of fertilizer. For the bag grade, you would apply roughly 1.5 cups of tomato tone to each tomato plant over the course of about 3 to 4 months, giving you the ability to fully fertilize 24 tomato plants. Now, if you don't have any other plants to fertilize, then that's a great deal, since it's a single, all-encompassing product to purchase. But buying the root ingredients in large bags gives you the same fertilizing power, but with plenty of leftovers to use in your other plants that probably have different fertilization requirements. Obviously, I'll link to the products and ingredients that I use and recommend most often in the description below. So now that you've got some ideas as to how to dose out organic fertilizer from scratch or for some random store-bought product, and you understand the importance of priming your fertilizer into the potting soil that you're going to be using, it's finally time to sow our seed into our seed starting mix, into the little containers. Most people realize that watering the seed at the correct temperature will jumpstart the germination process, especially when that seed is touching some sort of growing medium. But when I sprout tomatoes, I have no desire to wait 7 to 10 days to get my first sprouts, especially when I can get them in 4 days, virtually 100% of the time. You see, when I can germinate them that fast, I don't even have to really think about watering them to get them to germinate. But that's because I've refined a method where I kind of set it and then forget it. I prepare the seed starting mix, I prep the seed, and then I pre-water the soil, and then I plant. With virtually no fail ever, I always have the plants growing about 96 hours later. 4 days. This following segment shows exactly how you can replicate my process at small scale.
You see that right there? I just grew this tiny baby tomato plant from seed in less than 4 days.
Actually, to be precise, it only took 83 hours from seed to sprout. In this video, I'd like to explain how you can germinate your own tomato plants, just like this one, from seed, as soon as humanly possible, with a near 100% success rate. Full disclosure, right out of the gate, I used simple equipment to control the environment. Everything I used, I already owned. To get seeds to germinate reliably and fast, you have to closely control the environment. To do this, I used a kitchen bowl, warm tap water, a ceramic kitchen plate, a heating pad, the kind that you'd use on your back, and a thermostat power strip. Admittedly, most people don't already own a power strip like this, but I did buy mine a long time ago for around $45, and I've used it for lots of seed starting. The strip has easily paid for itself already. And these days, it costs even less than when I bought it.
As for the seed, it helps to use fresh seeds. However, the seed I used for this plant was dated 3 years ago, November 2021. So don't worry if yours are a few years old. Assuming they were stored well, they should still pop just fine. The trick to fast germination, though, is to take your seed and soak it for 6 hours in warm tap water. I started with water that was probably 90 degrees or so from the tap, dropped the seed into the water, and then I just walked away, letting it sit out on the kitchen counter. Obviously, the water slowly cooled down to room temperature, which is fine. It just doesn't make any sense to soak the seed in cold water from the tap. Sure, that cold water will warm up, but it doesn't quite have the same benefit as starting warm and cooling down. While the seed was soaking, I prepped my seed starting mix. In this case, it was just a mixture of peat moss and a bit of worm castings. You could use just about anything. I made sure to dampen the mixture just enough to be obviously damp, but not anywhere close to dripping wet. Like seriously, not close to dripping wet. I placed the mixture into my pot and then the pot onto the plate. I then put the plate on the heat mat, inserted the thermostat probe into the dirt, and I covered the whole thing up with an upside down kitchen bowl. Now, if you were starting a full tray of starts, which we do sometimes, then you have to have and use a full-size humidity dome to go over the tray. But not everyone needs to start that many plants at the same time. I rarely do. A bowl works just fine for just a few small starts over the course of a few days. The thermostat probe basically tracks the temperature of the growing medium, in this case, peat moss. I set the power strip to turn the heat mat on when the soil dropped to 79 degrees, and then turn the heat mat off once the soil got up to 81 degrees. Obviously, the goal here is to keep slightly damp soil at 80 degrees at all times. This works really well. Tomatoes will germinate just fine in warmer and cooler temperatures, but 80 degrees seems to be the sweet spot for speed for the majority of the varieties I've grown. Not to mention the fact that 80 degrees is just really simple to remember off the top of your head. As for the seed that is soaking, we want to saturate the seed as best as possible with warm water before putting it in the dirt. Submersion in water will saturate it much faster than placing a dry seed in damp soil. The soil will eventually saturate the seed, but it's slower, and that makes the germination time stretch out. That's something that we don't want. After a full 6-hour soak, and after my seed starting mix has fully warmed up to 80 degrees, I then used a chopstick to insert a single seed into a teeny tiny hole, and I covered it barely. At this point, you just put the bowl back over the top of everything and then wait about 3 days. Towards the end of the 3rd day, you're going to find yourself peeking under the bowl often, waiting to see that first baby sprout. I didn't even have to water the seed once after I put it in the dirt. For me, once the seed was in the dirt, I saw my first sprout 77 hours later. Adding in the seed soaking time, that meant I went from a dry seed in the packet to a baby plant in just 83 hours. That's just shy of 3.5 days. From this point, I'll be putting this baby plant under the simplest grow light setup possible. That's going to keep it growing until it's mature enough to be potted up. For this tomato and many others that I grow every year, I'll be using my own handmade fertilizer blend instead of bagged compost or packaged fertilizers that you can buy at the store. Assuming you follow that process or not, you should start seeing your seedlings popping out of that seed starting mix somewhere around day 7 to 10, if not beforehand, just by keeping that seed and seed starting mix damp in your garage, your shed, greenhouse, or even your kitchen counter. If your average soil temperatures during that process are 90 degrees or above, or 60 degrees and below, you might start seeing some delays in germination, and some of your seed might not germinate at all. I'm going to assume, however, that you're going to have success. And that brings us to the next important segment, watering those seedlings correctly. This is going to span roughly 14 to 21 days, and it starts the day that you start seeing your first seedlings emerge from your seed starting mixture. Although mature tomato plants require a good deal of water every single week, seedlings have very unique and very specific watering requirements. Their needs differ quite a bit from mature plants. I tend to think that watering seedlings well is actually more important than getting good lighting on those seedlings in those first few days. But before I delve too far into that debate, let's look closer at how to water your baby seedlings as perfectly as possible. One of the easiest ways to stunt the growth of your baby tomato plants is to water them poorly when they're just seedlings. Obviously, seedlings will need water, but if you give them too much, then their young root systems can drown, leading to death of the plant. Too little water will desiccate the plant, leading to death also. But ironically, this is less of a concern in my experience, especially when those seedlings are started indoors. When I start tomatoes from seed, I usually water the soil that I plant into before I add my seed, and then I never water the soil again until the plant has actually sprouted 4 days later. Yes, my tomatoes almost always sprout in 4 days. I'll link to a video describing how I do this with a virtual 100% success rate every time in the description below. But once the seedling emerges, that's when watering the plant correctly becomes the main priority. A lack of adequate lighting comes in at a close second, but again, in my experience, poor lighting in the very first few days can be fixed more easily than poor watering in those same first few days. Now, a quick Google search will tell you that tomato plants need roughly 1.5 inches of water per week per square foot of soil, and that you should water deeply a couple times per week rather than daily. But the rules are far different for seedlings and for young plants. I tend to water my seedlings, those plants that sprouted less than 7 days ago, daily. But I only add a tiny amount of water to the soil. If you're doing it right, you'll have your seedling in a starter container with holes in the bottom. This allows for good aeration, but it also allows for controlled bottom watering. Placing your starter container in a tray, bowl, or cup allows you to add water to the lower container so that the water can seep up into the soil from the bottom at a natural pace. I don't let the starter plant sit in the water for very long though, usually just a minute or so, and then I drain the excess water from the bottom container and let any excess water drain out from the upper container for the rest of the day. Indoors, evaporative loss will be very low. So once the plant has been growing for about a week or so, I switch over to every second day watering until I do my first transplant after the plant has been growing for roughly 3 weeks. For a single plant start, sitting in one small bottom container, I usually add about 1/8 of a cup of water to the bottom container and let the seedling sit in it for about a minute. This ensures the bottom portion of the soil gets plenty damp while the top of the soil stays on the drier side. This results in a plant that wants to grow roots lower and deeper right out of the gate. Later on, this makes it easier to transition over to less frequent bottom watering every 2 or 3 days. If you're growing a small cell pack or a tray, a full tray of plant starts, then a good rule of thumb I follow is to fill the tray up with water barely higher than the drain holes of your seedling containers. You can then set the seedling containers in the water for about a minute before draining the rest away. Do this once every day, and the root zone will always be damp, but not wet. And the surface will always be dry, but not too dry. If you're growing these seedlings outside, where it may be hotter, drier, or windier, where evaporative loss will occur much quicker, then I'll steep my starter container in that pool of water for maybe 2 to 5 minutes, depending on the harshness of the outdoor conditions. Starting seedlings outside in the heat of summer, something that most people won't do, might require a watering as described a couple times a day. But again, this is not a common or advised time of the year to start these kinds of plants outside, in my opinion. Now, eventually, when your seedling plants get to around 3 weeks old and you start transplanting them, then your watering habits should change just a bit again. The change is subtle though, and it's all about stimulating extra rooting on the buried stem. I go into that in another video here on the channel. Now in that video segment, I mentioned that getting poor lighting on your plant was less detrimental than watering your plant poorly. The reason for that is if you drown your root system on those baby seedlings, the seedlings can die in a very short period of time. And the same goes for if you let them dry out. There's no recovery. But if you get bad lighting on those plants in those first few days, then the plants are just going to get a little bit leggy, a little bit lanky. They're going to start stretching out, trying to find whatever light they can. Eventually, they might bend over, searching for light, to the point where they get too top-heavy and start falling over on themselves. At that point, they're going to start dying.
But you see, a lanky tomato seedling that only got a bit of indirect light over its first few days of life can be easily recovered. And I'm going to fully demonstrate how this is possible in this next segment. If you have trouble keeping your vegetable seedlings from getting too leggy and then falling over on themselves before dying, then look closely. The problem is rarely bad seed, and the problem is not usually caused by over or underwatering. Many times growers see slouching plants, and then they exacerbate the problem by overwatering. But the root cause is frequently inadequate lighting. When you place a seedling in a windowsill, the plant will stretch out towards it, leaning in the direction of the light. If the light is only short-lived, a few hours a day, then the lean can really overwhelm the plant quickly. If you have grow lights that are too high above the plant, it can stretch upwards, trying to get closer to the light until its upper weight can no longer be supported by its trunk. Even the best grow light will lose intensity very quickly as you add inches of space between the light source and the foliage of your plant. In this demonstration, you can clearly see how placing the light source extremely close to the plant results in it rearranging its position to grab the light from directly above. This time lapse is sped up nearly 100 times. This baby tomato plant, which only spent 2 days on a countertop away from direct sunlight, nearly fell over under its own weight looking for sunlight. By placing a grow light directly over the top of it, just an inch from its leaves caused it to stand back up on its own in just 2 hours. Indoors, we have to understand that our lighting is the most important factor in our plant's young growth. Now, it's important to understand that you don't actually need a big fancy grow light setup or any grow lights at all to grow tomato seedlings. Years ago, my wife and I started all of our plants on the kitchen table. We would keep them on the kitchen table at night. Every single day in the morning, we would take them outside and set them on the patio in direct sunlight, unless the weather was particularly bad. But for the good days, we would do that, and then we would bring them back in just before dusk. They all grew just fine. The grow lights just make it easier and simpler, especially when you've got a lot of plants that you're starting all at the same time. It can be a little bit cumbersome, possibly a little bit annoying, having to take those in and out all the time. Regardless of that, by the time your baby tomato plants are now 2 to 3 weeks old, kind of in that 14 to 21 day period, you're going to have to actually start fertilizing those tomato starts, those seedlings, typically with a liquid fertilizer if it's sitting in a seed starting mix. Or you can do what I do and pull them out of their starter tray and stick them into the potting soil that we primed a few weeks before we put the seed in the dirt. If you do indeed start priming your soil roughly 3 weeks before you sow seed, and then you wait 3 weeks after that seed has germinated, then that's about 6 weeks of priming. All of that fertilizer that's in your self-made potting soil is going to be ready for plant uptake almost immediately. This next segment is all about how I take these plants in that 2 to 3 week period and transplant or pot them up into the potting soil that we primed earlier in the season. I pot them up so that they have the nutrients that they're going to need to continue to grow and establish roots, but I also pot them extra deep so that I can stimulate as much root mass as possible. It's not weird to pot up tomato plants. Actually, it's quite intuitive. And if you use well-primed soil, like this stuff that I made 5 weeks ago, it works better. But there's an even better way to pot up your tomatoes, a way to improve the process even more than most people realize. The typical gardener knows that tomato plants can be planted quite deep, and that their entire stem is capable of growing additional root mass. This is fairly common knowledge. When you transplant a tomato plant into a garden bed or into a large container, we're told to bury the trunk up to the first set of leaves and then prune that stem so that leaves are never touching the soil. What is less known, however, is that you can easily pot up a baby tomato plant into a fairly small container, but way deeper than most people realize. Most seed starting trays or pots are only about 1.5 inches tall, give or take, and the next size up is around 3 inches. These would be those 2x3 containers. Many growers leave these young plants in these 2x3 containers until they're ready for the garden, and that's when they plant them extra deep.
Inside a container this size, you don't get roots extending beyond 3 inches. What I do differently, though, is I plant them deep, well before they get the pleasure of entering the actual garden. And the way that I do that is to put them into deep tumbler-style cups, cups that stand between 6 to 8 inches tall. This allows me to develop a plant that has 5 to 6 to 7 inches of root depth, twice as much as a standard tomato plant would have. You could buy deep, standard-sized garden plant containers for this, but they are quite wide and they require a lot of space and a lot of extra soil to fill them up. With a tumbler cup or even a cheap plastic party cup, you get all the depth with very little girth. When those seedlings have been growing for 2 to 3 weeks in their starter medium, they can easily be removed from the soil and the root mass can be easily teased apart. I mix that seed starter medium together with my previously prepared and fertilized growing soil, and then I place the root ball at the bottom of the cup. Holding the stem near the leaves, I cut off the cotyledons and then slowly add soil around the main stem until the soil reaches the top of the cup. Basically, I'm taking a tiny plant that stands only a couple of inches high from those first leaves to its pinnacle, and I sink its roots and main trunk roughly 6 to 7 inches under the soil. At this point, 2/3 to 3/4 of the plant is underground. Because this plant is not ready to go outside yet, I would rather it spend its energy on developing a substantial root system for the next month prior to me transplanting it outside into its final growing location. This plant that I'm featuring in this video was seeded 19 days ago, and it's only been growing above ground for 15 days. If I keep it in this new growing location for the next 4 weeks, then that will give me substantial root mass that can easily be sunk into the ground deep or laterally in a trench. Because tomatoes naturally want to form a root ball instead of a deep tap root, we have to do this to ensure we get a root ball that has some height to it. Those extra roots will give this plant the resiliency to hold up to deep, infrequent watering as opposed to regular, shallow watering. And the foliage will be less likely to go dry and the fruit will be less likely to split whenever a random rain or a heavy irrigation hits. Because tomatoes don't like cool soil, growing these extra roots indoors prior to transplanting outside won't stunt the early production of the plant, but it will result in a healthier and more productive plant down the road. In this video, I'm using the double cup method. It helps keep excess moisture draining from the growing soil or wicking up into the growing soil as needed. But you don't need to do this. Placing these cups in a full-size tray works just as good, so long as you prevent too much standing water from accumulating in the tray. I find that growing 1 or 2 or 3 plants in the double cup method works better than using a full-size tray. If I'm growing a whole bunch of plants, then the tray is probably the way to go. After you've repotted your tomato and sunk the initial root mass as deep into your cup as possible, we need to alter our watering habits one more time to encourage rooting on the newly buried stem. Most people realize that the entire stem of a tomato plant will be able to develop new roots, but the soil that the trunk is touching needs to be moist for this to happen. If it's too dry, then the rooting will barely happen at all. If all we do is lightly bottom water, then the moisture will cause the vast majority of root mass formation to occur 4 to 5 inches below the surface, which isn't really a bad thing, but it doesn't do us much good for developing root mass up and down the entire buried trunk. Because our soil contains ample fertilizer, I don't add any extra nutrients to my water, nor do I add any extra biostimulants. The only thing I do is add roughly a 1/4 cup of water every 2 to 3 days to the base of the plant, in addition to the light bottom watering that I talked about earlier in this video. This ensures that the soil immediately touching the buried trunk is always slightly moist, even if the surrounding surface soil dries out. When the trunk is touching moist soil, it will start rooting just like it is deeper in the profile, the root ball that we buried earlier. It's important to do this right, otherwise you might lose your plant and have to start all over again from scratch. As you can see right here, a full 4 weeks after repotting this plant, the size has increased significantly. If I were to pull this plant out of its soil now, we could see plenty of roots all up and down the freshly buried stem. I also have other supporting videos with tomato growing tips linked in the description below. If this plant was ready for the outside world 4 weeks ago, it's certainly ready to take on the real world today.
Take some time to see what I have down there. Many frequently asked questions are answered in those videos.
The only thing left to do at this point is prepare this plant for the outside world by hardening it off, which I cover in other videos here on the channel. Make sure to see the following video all about hardening off your tomato plant before planting them outside in the garden.